In AD 52, the Christian apostle Thomas sailed to India with an eyewitness account of Jesus of Nazareth dying and coming back to life. At first, Thomas had seriously questioned his friends' reports of Jesus' resurrection, demanding evidence for himself and earning the nickname Doubting Thomas. So why did he now travel halfway around the world and risk his life to report it? Had he found evidence of afterlife? There's a big question. We'll visit the Thomas sites in our classic Hindustan ambassador taxi and look at the evidence for and against his story of Jesus' resurrection. We'll talk to specialists, some skeptical about Jesus' resurrection.
The historian, acting as a historian, cannot affirm that a great miracle such as the resurrection has happened.
And some who take it as genuine history.
The evidence for Jesus' resurrection is actually very good.
Some say we're accidents in a universe born by chance. Some say we're children of God. I'm Grenville Kent, a Christian academic, and the new atheists have got me questioning my faith. So I'm going wherever the questions take me with my ever-curious son, Marcus, and talking to leading thinkers on both sides of the God question. Because I really want the evidence. Is there a God? And will I ever find a hat that fits? Thomas came to tell people he had personally seen his friend alive days after his death. People must have believed him because he started his first church here at Kadungalore. Thomas had been depressed by Jesus' crucifixion and death. While the other disciples said they'd seen Jesus alive again, Thomas refused to believe them until he could see Jesus himself and poke his finger into his wounds. But now in India, Thomas became the eyewitness, telling the story of life after death. We'll visit key sites from Thomas's history to follow his 20-year journey across southern India to the opposite coast where he was killed. On the road, we'll weigh the evidence for the resurrection he talked about. We tried a modern Indian car.
It was pretty small.
About the size of a motorcycle. But we wanted more negotiating power, so we rented something solid. The famous ambassador taxi. I read that India has 1% of the world's vehicles and 15% of the world's road fatalities. So these roads are a perfect place to talk about afterlife. But could you really travel to India back then?
It was quite easy to get to India in the first centuries because there was the monsoon wind, which used to take all the sailing ships from the mouth of the Red Sea all the way to Kerala directly in less than 40 days. Pliny the Elder says every year 121 ships used to come to India.
Leaving the port, Thomas started another church nearby, on land donated by the Maharaja. It's still active 20 centuries later. A nearby street has something you might not expect in India.
Excuse me, sir. Where is Jew Street, please? Jew Street.
Go and left.
Thank you.
Straight and left.
Thank you very much.
All of Jesus' disciples were Jews, and they visited synagogues wherever they went, teaching that the long-awaited Jewish Messiah was Jesus of Nazareth. There were 7 Jewish colonies here in Kerala, and synagogues dated to the 1st century, the time of Thomas. The Jewish people came to India for the spice trade. Fort Cochin has been a trading port for over 3,000 years. As early as 950 BC, Israel's King Solomon sent ships to Odhu, or India, bringing back spices and monkeys and peacocks. Spice is still one of India's top exports today. The scent of pepper and ginger has fired up Jewish traders since ancient times. Most of Thomas's churches are near ancient Jewish communities. In Cochin's ancient synagogue, we're reminded that the Christian writer Paul, a contemporary of Thomas, says Jesus' followers took his message to the Jew first and then to other nations. Some writers doubt Thomas's message of afterlife. Professor Bart Ehrman is a best-selling Jesus scholar who was a Christian, but now doesn't believe in God.
Jesus, historically, is best understood as an apocalyptic preacher, as somebody who proclaimed that God was soon going to intervene in history and overthrow the forces of evil and bring in a good kingdom on earth. The basic point was that this world of pain and suffering is not the end of the story. Death doesn't have the last word. God has the last word. He was wrong about that, but apocalypticists have always been wrong about that. And the reason is because I don't think there is a God who's going to intervene.
Dr. William Lane Craig is a Christian New Testament scholar and philosopher.
It's physically impossible, given all that we know medically and biologically, that a person would naturally come back to life after truly being dead. But the resurrection isn't that Jesus naturally came back to life again. It is that God raised him from the dead. And so the plausibility of that event will depend entirely on whether or not you believe in the existence of God.
India already had 330 million gods in the sophisticated religion of Hinduism, with its view of afterlife or afterlives. Thomas reached out to Hindus and other religions. And many people believed him.
Among the people that Thomas baptized here at Palayur were some Brahmins, Hindu priests of the very highest caste. And we still know their family names: Kali, Kalikau, Sankarapuri, and Pakalomatom. Thomas ordained one from each family and trained them for Christian ministry. Hindus on their way to the temple wash their whole bodies in a big pool like this one. And Thomas used this as a site for Christian baptism. Going under the water symbolizes Christ's death, and coming up, his resurrection.
The resurrection of Jesus and of the believer is still the basic message of Christianity today. However, Professor Bart Ehrman seriously questions the origins of the resurrection story.
After Jesus died, some of his disciples said he got raised from the dead, and they tried to convince others that he's the Son of God who died and was raised from the dead. And in order to convert others, they had to tell stories. They told stories about what Jesus said and did, and originally these stories would have been told by Jesus' own followers who had seen him say and do these things. But as soon as they start converting people, these people they convert other people, who convert other people, who convert other people, and it spreads throughout the Roman Empire. And the vast majority of these people telling these stories hadn't been there, they weren't eyewitnesses, they didn't know eyewitnesses.
And yet Thomas was an eyewitness. He had poked the wounds of Jesus for himself. And he came to India very soon after. This is the oldest Christian church in the world, originally built in AD 63.
So if Jesus dies in AD 31 and Thomas reaches South India by 52, about the same time Paul is writing and preaching to the Greek city of Corinth, that's only about 20 years. And Thomas has already been to Iran and the Punjab and other places with the story of Jesus. 20 years is living memory. Where's the time period needed for the story of Jesus to evolve a resurrection?
Did Thomas teach the same gospel of Jesus that we know today?
The Creed of the Apostles, which is the earliest statement of the Christian faith. This is agreed to by practically all the major churches, and also the apostles themselves were agreed on these things, because they went from Jerusalem to different parts of the world, no means of communication. But all of them taught the same things.
Christianity here has always taught Jesus' death and resurrection, just like anywhere else in the world. Thomas and the other apostles, separated by huge distances, are all telling the same story. We jumped on a barge to explore the backwaters of Kerala, the alternative highways for the spice trade, then and now.
If someone told you they'd seen a resurrection, wouldn't you want extraordinary evidence? So what evidence is there for the resurrection of Jesus?
First would be the fact that after his crucifixion and burial, Jesus' tomb was in fact discovered empty by a group of his women followers on the Sunday morning after his crucifixion. The second fact would be that thereafter, various individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death under a variety of circumstances and at various locations. The third fact would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead despite having every predisposition to the contrary.
Thomas is involved in two of these three lines of evidence. He doesn't see the empty tomb, but he sees Jesus alive again. And this leaves him with no doubts, so that he comes here telling the story.
Still got four wheels, we're okay.
But we weren't. Was it the heat or the massive pothole? With help from some very kind locals, we got rolling again.
What can possibly go wrong?
Thomas really covered some territory.
Those frescoes were painted in 1519, which seems old, except that 3/4 of India's Christian history happened before then. Christianity was here well before it reached much of Europe.
Sometimes people will say, how can you believe anything that was written 2,000 years ago? And I think what they don't understand is that what matters is not the time gap between the writings and today. What matters is the time gap between the writings and the events that the writings are about. If that time gap is narrow, then it doesn't matter how long the evidence and the events have receded into the past. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the passage of time.
Arriving at our hotel, we saw some kids playing India's favourite game.
Oh, that's a lovely shot from Hollis.
Sir, I'm very, very sorry about that. Hitting the police, not a good career move. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Next morning, we found our 6th church.
Here we are, perfect. Local tradition says 1,600 high caste Hindus believed Thomas's story and were baptized here in AD 52.
One church to go.
My view is that, in fact, historians can say some things about the resurrection. They can't say that God raised Jesus from the dead, because that's a theological statement. But what they can say is that Jesus' followers claimed that Jesus came alive again. And they claimed they had visions of him afterwards. And I think that's completely plausible historically. Some of the followers of Jesus actually had visions of him. People have visions all the time. Sometimes they have visions because they're seeing things that are really there, and sometimes they have visions because they're hallucinating. The Christians will say, well, it's because Jesus really showed up to them, and the non-Christian will say, well, they were hallucinating.
Well, the difficulty with that, I think, is the very public nature of some of the evidence. For example, the empty tomb in Jerusalem. It's extraordinary that belief in Jesus' resurrection originated not in far-off Galilee, far from the place he was crucified, but in the very city where he was publicly crucified and buried. If that tomb were still occupied, the Jewish authorities would have been only too happy to point it out. But the hallucination hypothesis faces all sorts of difficulties, just one of which is that if the disciples were to project visions of Jesus, they would have projected visions of Jesus in heaven, where he would have gone to be with God. That's what happened to dead people in Jewish thinking. But in that case, it would never have led to belief in his resurrection.
We waited for a train. And another. And another. And as the air conditioner dropped the temperature to just 35 degrees Celsius, we wondered why there was no documentary evidence of Thomas in India.
The reason may be the style of writing here is on the palmyra leaves, which will not survive for long because of the monsoon and the climate. Or later, when the Portuguese have come, they might have destroyed it for their theological purposes.
Very little is known because the historical books, no documents of that first century. We never had any in secular history also. So if you say something church history, you say produce it. Then we say produce the history, there was a secular state or administration. There is nothing of that sort. Most of the scholars will say, let us accept it as it is. There's a tradition, not say that this is historical document. We don't have the document. About 8 million Indian Christians trace their history back to St. Thomas. Thomas Christians will say, we are descendants of the first century converts.
This is in the consciousness of every person in India, irrespective of religion or caste. Everybody says Thomas came to India and made people Christians.
What Thomas has communicated through his preaching stayed in this country.
So what ideas did Thomas leave in India? We drove a family to church in 43 degrees Celsius heat. Their church was built in AD 64, and this community has over 19 centuries worth of oral history. What do Christians here believe?
St. Thomas wanted to be an eyewitness rather than just hearing from others.
Thomas insisted on seeing Jesus and only then believing it. Not that he was a doubting Thomas, because he wanted to see Jesus, to touch him, and then confirm his belief in Jesus, and then come to India and spread the message of Jesus' arrival.
Without resurrection, no Christianity.
So Jesus told to Thomas that you have seen me and believed in me. Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet believed. So I think Jesus had been trying to refer to those people like me who have not seen Jesus. So he was referring to the future generations to which the gospel is going to be preached.
Resurrection is the center of their faith, and they trace their faith back to Thomas. It's at this point that Thomas goes inland, leaving the boats and heading across India to the east coast, where he will meet his death. Does it get any prettier than this? The kind of day you really want to last forever. The idea of eternal bliss is obviously appealing, but I'm only interested if it's also true. So what loopholes could there be in Thomas's story of afterlife?
If you're one of the disciples of Jesus, let's say you want to fake his resurrection. How could you do it?
Making up a story?
Okay, you'd all have to agree to cook up a story together. Conspiracy.
The conspiracy theory faces a number of problems. For example, why would these men be willing to die for a lie that they themselves had made up?
You might tell a fiction story if it earned you money or popularity, but if it threatened your life, you'd stop. But even under threat of violent death, Jesus' disciples didn't stop.
The conspiracy theory cannot really take seriously what a disaster the crucifixion was for these first century followers of Jesus. It just wasn't that their leader was gone. Rather, it was that he had been exposed as a fake. There's no conception in Jewish literature of a Messiah who, instead of establishing David's throne in Jerusalem and throwing off the yoke of Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by Israel's enemies as a criminal.
Travelling through Spice Country, Thomas starts his next church in Nilakal, on a mountain 300 kilometres away. That's 9 hours' drive on these roads.
What if Jesus didn't really die on the cross and he just looked dead and fainted?
The Roman crucifiers of Jesus were professional executioners. They knew how to make sure that a person was dead before he was taken down from the cross. And the spear thrust into Jesus' side probably pierced the heart and was a commonly attested means of ensuring death of crucified victims. In any case, Jesus, even if he had been still alive, placed in a tomb without immediate medical attention would have certainly died of exposure. And how he could then get out of a tomb sealed from the inside with a stone weighing thousands of pounds is just implausible. And in any case, a half-dead Jesus appearing to the disciples, bleeding, desperately in need of bandaging and medical attention, would hardly have elicited in them the belief that he was the risen Lord and the conqueror of death.
We got there late, only to find the church had been moved 8 kilometres away because of religious extremism. We might just tick this one off and get some sleep.
Sure.
Thomas told his story and started churches across the Malabar, today called Kerala. And then he worked his way across the continent to Chennai. India was a risky place in those days, and religious authorities could stir up violence to stop a competitor. Coming to Thomas's final destination, one of the big arguments for the resurrection is that witnesses like Thomas were willing to take massive risks and even to die for their story. And if you knew a story was a lie, why would you die for it?
The reason that claim is problematic is that we actually don't know what happened to the disciples of Jesus. And we certainly have no evidence that they were all martyred for their faith. It does appear that the disciple Peter was martyred, possibly during the reign of Emperor Nero in Rome. Paul was probably martyred. It may well be that John was martyred. We don't know about the others. There are legends about all of these apostles in written form from starting in the late 2nd century, so 100 years after they were dead, including Thomas.
The apostles didn't bother writing their own stories. They were too busy telling the story of Jesus. But we do have strong traditions about them, and there's a clear oral tradition of Thomas dying in Chennai. We arrived at the National Shrine. Like St. Peter's in Rome or St. James's in Spain, it's built on the Apostles' original grave. Little Mount, where Thomas lived for a time, now has a sculpture park featuring a fit carpenter Jesus and an Indian-looking Roman governor. You don't have to find all the trimmings convincing to see the basic history as accurate.
That footprint is 3 times bigger than my foot. It's in stone, and there's only one. So forgive me if I'm a doubting Thomas about some of the miracle claims Christians make. You can still see a solid core of historic truth in the Thomas story.
You can admire the cave where Thomas lived without necessarily believing he left a fingerprint in the stone. Dr. Philip pointed out a subtlety in all the crosses we'd seen.
The uniqueness of this St. Thomas cross is it doesn't have a crucifix. These crosses have butts on each of his arms, which represent life. Cross is not an end, but it is a new beginning and a new life. That was the message that Thomas brought to India.
We've travelled across a nation of 1 billion people, seen the world's oldest church, spoken to historians and believers. It's clear that there was a historical figure called Thomas who came here early and who really believed Jesus had come back to life and wanted to take that belief to the end of the known world. He thought it was worth dying for. Today, 30 million Indians believe him, as do over 2 billion others around the world. But why does it matter? What does it look like to live without hope of afterlife?
People who have a kind of deconversion experience find it emotionally quite wrenching. It took me a number of years, actually, to get over it. I have a good friend who said that I went from being born again to being dead again. I personally find more happiness in life now than I did when I was a believer. And I suppose my happiness is rooted in the understanding that life is to be cherished, because I think this life is all that we have.
The resurrection of Jesus gives grounds for hope in complete physical, and psychological healing. All of us are broken, emotionally damaged people that bear emotional scars from our past. And the resurrection of Jesus holds out promise that someday we will be whole, integrated, psychologically transparent persons living together in a community of likewise reconciled and forgiven people. It gives us hope and purpose and confidence for living. Not a hope that's based in some myth or pie-in-the-sky wishful thinking, but grounded in undeniable facts of history.
Afterlife fascinates me. I can't take a documentary crew into the afterlife. Well, maybe I could, but I couldn't bring them back. My atheist friends see death as the obliteration of a person. But believers say, why be content with 70 years when you can look forward to an eternity of bliss and love and freedom? And that makes sense to me intuitively and really adds something to ordinary life. Like Thomas, I don't want fairy stories or being told what to believe. I want a rational faith based on evidence and credible sources. And I find Thomas credible, initially skeptical, convinced by his own experience, and then standing by his eyewitness story of afterlife, even under threat of death. I want to stay curious and keep asking big questions and poking my finger into mysteries, seeking an ever more personal connection to my Lord and my God. What do you think?